You've probably noticed that people in power get nervous around large gatherings. Not always. Not every gathering. A sports stadium doesn't threaten them. A concert doesn't threaten them. A shopping mall on Black Friday doesn't threaten them. But certain kinds of gatherings do. The ones where people gather around shared belief, around moral conviction, around the sense that something is deeply wrong and must be made right. The ones where people stop thinking of themselves as individuals and start thinking of themselves as we. And here's what's interesting. Throughout history, whenever that kind of gathering happens, whenever people unite around shared sacred purpose, leaders respond the same way. Not just authoritarian leaders, not just ancient tyrants. All leaders, democratic leaders, progressive leaders, leaders who claim to support freedom of assembly and freedom of belief, they get nervous. Sometimes they suppress, sometimes they surveil, sometimes they co-opt, sometimes they just watch very carefully. But they always respond. Why do leaders across every type of government, across every era, fear religious movements? Before we keep going, if this kind of quiet thinking is your thing, you might want to subscribe to Belief Explained Simply. These videos move slowly, sit with questions, and don't rush to conclusions. And if you know someone who enjoys conversations like this, feel free to share it with them. All right, let's keep going. There's a pattern worth noticing. Religious movements don't just challenge specific policies. They challenge something deeper. They challenge the idea that political authority is the highest authority. When someone says God commands this, they're implicitly saying, your laws don't override that. When someone says, my conscience won't allow it, they're implicitly saying your authority has limits. And that's the thing leaders can't tolerate. Not because they're evil, not because they hate religion, but because governance requires a monopoly on ultimate authority. If people obey a higher law than the state's law, the state's power becomes conditional, negotiable, secondary, and once authority becomes conditional, it's no longer authority. It's just one voice among many. Let's look at some examples, not to prove a point, just to see the pattern. Rome tolerated dozens of religions, hundreds of gods. You could worship whatever you wanted, except you also had to participate in the imperial cult. You had to offer incense to the emperor's statue. You had to acknowledge that Caesar's authority was supreme. Most religions complied. They said, fine, we'll do the ritual. It doesn't conflict with our gods, but early Christians refused, not because they were being persecuted for believing in Jesus. Rome didn't care what you believed. They were persecuted because they refused to acknowledge that any earthly power was ultimate. They said, we answer to a higher authority. And if your laws conflict with that authority, we won't comply. That's what got them killed, not their theology, their refusal to grant the state final say. Fast forward, the Soviet Union didn't ban religion because of atheism. Plenty of atheists lived peacefully under other systems. They banned it because religious authority competed with state authority. The Orthodox Church had moral authority. People confessed to priests, not party officials. People sought guidance from Scripture, not from Lenin. That was intolerable. Not because the church was preaching rebellion, but because it represented an alternative source of meaning. An alternative answer to the question, who decides what's right? The state needed that answer to be the state. Any other answer was a threat. Here's where it gets more complicated. Even in democracies, systems designed to protect religious freedom, leaders get nervous about religious movements. Not about religion in general. About movements. About moments when religious belief becomes collective action. The civil rights movement in America was fundamentally religious. Black churches were the organizing centers. The language was biblical. The moral authority came from Scripture and from God. And that's exactly what made it powerful. Because when Martin Luther King Jr. said, we have a moral obligation to disobey unjust laws, he wasn't appealing to the Constitution. He was appealing to something higher than the Constitution. He was saying, your laws are wrong. And we know they're wrong because they violate a law you didn't write and can't change. That's terrifying to power. Not because it's wrong, but because it's uncontrollable. You can negotiate with political movements. You can offer concessions, adjust policies, co-opt leaders, but you can't negotiate with God. If someone believes God commands them to act, no amount of political pressure will stop them. That's why the FBI surveilled King, not because he was violent. He explicitly wasn't, but because he represented a movement that didn't derive its authority from the state, and movements that don't derive authority from the state can't be controlled by the state. Let's look at another example. Iran before 1979 was a secular state. The Shah modernized, westernized, suppressed religious influence in public life. And it worked, for a while, until it didn't, because the religious establishment, the mosques, the clerics, the shared Friday prayers, represented the one institution the Shah couldn't fully control. He controlled the military, the police, the media, the schools, but he couldn't control what imams said in mosques. He couldn't control what people believed about divine justice. And when the revolution came, it came from the mosques. Not because religion is inherently revolutionary, but because religious gathering spaces were the only spaces where an alternative authority could organize. The state had monopolized everything else. Religion was the one thing that claimed to answer to something higher than the state, and that claim, whether true or false, was enough. Here's the uncomfortable question. Is the fear justified? Are leaders right to be nervous about religious movements? History suggests sometimes yes. Religious movements have overthrown governments, have challenged laws, have refused to comply with authority. The Reformation shattered political order across Europe. The Taiping Rebellion killed millions. Islamic revolutions reshaped entire regions. Religious conviction, when mobilized collectively, has toppled empires. So from a leader's perspective, the fear is rational. If your job is to maintain order, stability, continuity of governance, then movements that answer to a higher authority are inherently destabilizing. They're unpredictable, uncontrollable, willing to suffer for principles you can't compromise away. That's dangerous, not morally dangerous, practically dangerous, because governance is fundamentally about control. And religious movements, by definition, can't be fully controlled. But here's the other side. What leaders fear in religious movements isn't actually religion. It's the structure religion provides for resistance. Religion offers a moral framework that exists independently of state power, a community that gathers regularly and builds trust outside state surveillance, a narrative that explains suffering and makes sacrifice meaningful, a leadership structure that doesn't depend on state legitimacy, an identity that transcends national, ethnic, or political categories. Those elements aren't unique to religion. Political movements can have them too. But religion has been providing them for thousands of years. The infrastructure is already built. The language is already familiar. The gathering spaces already exist, which means religion is the most readily available tool for organizing opposition. Not the only tool, but the most accessible one. And that's what leaders fear, not belief in God, the capacity to organize resistance around something the state can't touch. Let's notice something else. The pattern appears even when leaders themselves are religious. Medieval Christian kings feared heretical movements, not because the movements rejected Christianity, but because they rejected the king's version of Christianity. The Cathars, the Waldensians, the Lollards. These weren't atheist rebellions, they were competing claims about what God actually wanted, and those competing claims threatened the king's authority. Because the king's authority rested partly on divine approval. If a religious movement said, God doesn't approve of you, they weren't just criticizing policy, they were delegitimizing the entire basis of power. That's why heresy was treated as treason, because it was treason, not against God. Against the political order that claimed to represent God. Here's where it gets subtle. Modern secular states don't fear religion the same way ancient states did. They don't fear theological claims. They don't care if you believe in God or not. What they fear is the moment when belief becomes belonging. When I believe this becomes we believe this, and we're acting on it. That transition, from private faith to public movement, is what triggers state response. You can believe whatever you want in your head. You can worship however you want in designated spaces. But the moment you start organizing, gathering, mobilizing around those beliefs, that's when surveillance starts, when infiltration happens, when laws get passed to limit assembly or require registration, not because the state is anti-religious, but because the state is anti-competition. An organized religion at scale is competition. There's a historical irony here. The very thing that makes religious movements powerful, their claim to answer to something higher than earthly authority, is also what makes them vulnerable, because that claim can be used against them. Leaders can say, they're fanatics, they're unreasonable, they don't respect democratic processes, they think they're above the law. And sometimes that's true. Religious movements can become authoritarian, can refuse compromise, can demand total obedience to divine command. The same structure that enables resistance to tyranny can also enable its own form of tyranny. So when leaders fear religious movements, they're not always wrong. Sometimes they're fearing exactly what should be feared, a movement that won't negotiate, won't compromise, and believes it has divine permission to override everyone else's rights. The fear is symmetrical. Religious movements fear state power will crush conscience. State power fears religious movements will replace democratic governance with theocracy. Both fears have historical precedent. Let's look at what happens when leaders try to control religion. Option 1. Suppression. Ban it. Persecute believers. Drive it underground. This rarely works long-term because persecution creates martyrs, and martyrs strengthen belief. The early church grew faster under persecution than under tolerance. Soviet suppression of religion didn't eliminate belief. It just made believers more committed. Chinese restrictions on Christianity haven't stopped its growth. They've just made it more decentralized and harder to monitor. Suppression tends to purify movements, removes casual participants, leaves only the truly committed, which makes the movement smaller but more dangerous. Option 2. Co-option. Make religion serve the state, establish a state church, appoint religious leaders, control the message. Make religious authority dependent on political approval. This works better for a while. The Church of England, Russian Orthodoxy under the Tsars, state Shinto in Japan. But it has a cost. The religion loses moral authority, becomes seen as a tool of power rather than a check on power. And when that happens, either the religion dies, loses relevance, becomes empty ritual, or it splits. A reform movement emerges, claims to represent true faith against the corrupted state version. And you're back to the original problem, a religious movement the state can't control. Option 3. Accommodation. Guarantee religious freedom. Protect it constitutionally. Allow religious gathering, religious speech, religious organization, but maintain clear separation. Religion stays in its lane. State stays in its lane. This is the modern democratic approach, and it mostly works, except it works only as long as religious movements accept the separation, as long as they agree that religion is personal and private, and doesn't dictate public policy. The moment a religious movement says, our beliefs require us to change laws, the accommodation breaks down, because now you have competing claims to authority. The state says, we decide laws through democratic process. The religious movement says, democratic process can't override divine command, and there's no referee, no higher authority to adjudicate the dispute. So you get culture wars, legal battles, constant negotiation about where religious freedom ends and state authority begins. The accommodation is stable only when both sides accept limits. When either side refuses limits, conflict is inevitable. Here's something worth sitting with. The fear leaders have of religious movements isn't irrational paranoia. It's a recognition of something true. Religious movements have power that political movements don't, because political movements can be bought off, co-opted, defeated at the ballot box, or outlawed. But you can't outlaw conscience. You can't vote against someone's sense of divine calling. You can't compromise with martyrdom. If someone believes God requires them to act, the only way to stop them is force. And using force against religious movements tends to backfire, because force confirms the narrative, proves the movement is righteous, creates martyrs, strengthens resolve. So leaders are caught. They can't fully tolerate religious movements that challenge state authority, but they also can't fully suppress them without making them stronger. The fear is warranted, and also mostly helpless. Let's notice one more pattern. The religious movement's leaders fear most aren't the ancient, established ones. They're the new ones, the movements without institutional inertia, without wealth to protect, without political relationships to maintain. Established religions become manageable. They have buildings, budgets, bureaucracies. They have something to lose. So they moderate, they negotiate, they accept accommodation. But new religious movements, or renewed ones, revitalized by reform, don't have those constraints yet. They're pure belief without institutional weight, and that makes them unpredictable. The early church was feared more than established Judaism. Protestant reformers were feared more than the established Catholic Church. Salafist movements are feared more than traditional Sunni institutions, because the new movements haven't learned to compromise yet. Haven't been worn down by the need to survive within existing power structures. They still believe their cause is absolute, still willing to sacrifice everything. That's what leaders fear, not religion. Absolutism combined with organization. So here's the question that doesn't resolve. Is this fear of religious movements a bug or a feature? Is it authoritarians being authoritarian, or is it governments trying to prevent theocracy? Is it oppression of conscience, or is it protection of pluralism? Maybe it's both. Maybe the same dynamic looks like persecution from one angle and looks like preservation of democratic order from another. Maybe leaders are right to be wary of movements that claim authority higher than law, and maybe those movements are right to resist when laws violate conscience. Maybe there's no stable resolution, just constant negotiation. Constant tension between the state's need for order and the individual's need for meaning that the state doesn't provide. Between political authority and moral authority. Between what Caesar demands and what God demands. That tension has never been resolved. Every compromise is temporary. Every accommodation eventually breaks down when the stakes get high enough. You've probably noticed that people in power still get nervous around certain gatherings. Not all gatherings. Just the ones where people stop being individuals and become we. The ones where moral conviction starts to organize. The ones where people believe they answer to something higher than law. And maybe you've noticed something else. That the fear isn't going away. If anything, it's intensifying. Because in a fragmented world, where traditional institutions are weakening, where trust in government is low, where people are desperately searching for meaning, religious movements are one of the few remaining structures that can mobilize mass action around shared conviction. Which means the old pattern is repeating, leaders watching nervously, religious movements organizing, conflict becoming inevitable, not because anyone wants conflict, but because the fundamental question never got answered. When religious conviction and political authority conflict, who decides? The gatherings are still happening, the fear is still there, and the question is still open. If this raised something for you, an agreement, a disagreement, or even just a question, you're welcome to share it in the comments. Not answers, just what this brought up for you. I read them. Please subscribe, like, and share. This helps us to grow and create more content like this. Also, have you had an experience with our religious movement? We'll love to hear it.